In the pre-dawn silence of June 19th, 1944, a vast steel behemoth sliced through the tranquil Philippine Sea. It wasn't just a fleet, it was a floating city, a testament to raw, unbridled industrial power. 15 aircraft carriers, 7 fast battleships, 93 destroyers and cruisers, a testament to human ambition and a chilling harbinger of what was to come. This wasn't merely a collection of warships, it was Task Force 58, the beating heart of America's industrial might, an instrument of vengeance and fury that, just 2 short years prior, would have been unimaginable. More than 900 of the world's most advanced combat aircraft rested on those decks, each one a silent promise of air dominance. But as dawn approached, casting long shadows across the flight decks, the fate of the entire Pacific War, the course of human history itself, would hinge not on the Grand Armada, but on a single machine and the men who dared to fly it. What does absolute air dominance truly look, feel, and sound like? For the pilots of Fighting Squadron 16, striding across the deck of the USS Lexington, the answer was palpable, a thrumming tension in the very air around them. This was no ordinary sortie. This was the culmination of years of sacrifice, of relentless innovation, of lessons learned in blood and fire. For a young pilot named Jack Morrison, clambering into the cramped cockpit of his aircraft, tail number 23, the sensation was unmistakable. This wasn't just a new plane. It was a creed, a declaration. It was the F-6F Hellcat, a beast of steel and engineering, bristling with power. Beneath him, its 2,000 horsepower engine idled, a caged animal waiting for its moment to be unleashed. A roaring beast poised to descend upon an enemy who, in their wildest nightmares, could not have conceived what was heading their way. In that moment, Morrison held an unwavering belief. He was about to witness the complete annihilation of Japanese naval aviation. But could one aircraft, no matter how formidable, truly make such a profound, game-changing difference? The mission, codenamed Operation A-Go, was Japan's last desperate gamble, a Hail Mary pass thrown to halt the relentless American advance across the Pacific. Intelligence reports were grimly clear. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy's first mobile fleet, was throwing every last resource, every last ounce of strategic capital he possessed, into this fight. 9 carriers, every pilot he could find, a tragic mix of battle-hardened veterans and raw, terrified recruits, all committed to what would undoubtedly be a cataclysmic confrontation. For the American pilots, gathered for their final briefing by men whose faces bore the grim etchings of survival from the dark, desperate days of Guadalcanal, this wasn't a battle for survival. It had shifted. This was a battle for annihilation. The surging confidence that permeated the American ranks was not born of youthful arrogance or naive bravado. It was forged in the cold, hard steel of the machines they flew, in the meticulously calculated odds, in the undeniable advantage they held. How, in just 24 short, brutal months, had the balance of power shifted so dramatically, so completely, so irreversibly? The answer hummed beneath Morrison's feet as he meticulously ran through his pre-flight checklist. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a symphony of pistons and power, roared to life, a sound that was fast becoming the undeniable anthem of American victory in the Pacific. As the catapult officer delivered the decisive signal, the Hellcat surged forward, propelled into the pre-dawn sky with explosive force. Morrison climbed, part of a vast swarm of 36 fighters from his squadron alone, each one a flying fortress, a weapon of precision-engineered destruction, armed with 650 caliber machine guns. They were hunters, heading west, their destiny to intercept a massive, desperate enemy force, utterly confident that they were flying not just a good weapon, but the perfect weapon for the job ahead. After years of being pushed back, of fighting with their backs against the wall, was it truly possible that the hunter had finally, brutally, become the hunted? To truly grasp the scale of the triumph of 1944, one must first confront the visceral terror of 1942. In the harrowing months that followed the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the vast, unforgiving skies of the Pacific belonged unequivocally to the Japanese. Their weapon of choice, the Mitsubishi A6M0, was an engineering marvel, a deceptively elegant killing machine. It was impossibly light, eerily agile, and possessed an operational range that defied all Allied logistical and strategic logic. In the hands of Japan's battle-hardened pilots, the Zero wasn't just an airplane, it was a specter, a phantom that seemed to dance through the clouds with an almost supernatural grace. It moved as if it knew the very fabric of the sky better than any mortal could hope to. American pilots, flying the rugged but comparatively sluggish F-4F Wildcats, learned to dread its appearance. Some, scarred by the encounters, grimly remarked, "You didn't fight a Zero, you just tried not to die." Others, tragically, never got the chance to articulate their terror at all. The Zero's terrifying dominance stemmed from one brutal, uncompromising truth. It was designed for absolute, unmitigated offense. Every ounce of defensive capability was meticulously stripped away. Armor? Gone. Self-sealing fuel tanks, a vital safeguard? Sacrificed. Structural integrity? Traded away willingly for the intoxicating trinity of speed, range, and unparalleled maneuverability. In a dogfight, it could outturn, outclimb, and seemingly outthink anything America threw at it. Attempting to engage the Zero on its own terms, to meet its balletic agility with brute force, was nothing short of suicide. The Wildcat simply couldn't keep pace, couldn't outmaneuver it, and certainly couldn't outgun its potent armament. And when the Zero's twin 20mm cannons found their mark, even a glancing hit could transform an aircraft into scattered metal, spiraling fire, and a quick, anonymous death. Back home, across the vast expanse of the continent, parents received folded flags, their lives irrevocably shattered. In the Pacific, amidst the despair, engineers received vital flight data, cold, hard facts gleaned from the wreckage and the experiences of the few who returned. But desperation, as history so often reminds us, is the undeniable mother of invention. American pilots, against overwhelming odds, began to experiment. Quietly, desperately, they learned, not from textbooks, but from each blood-soaked failure. One such visionary was Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thack. He conceived a maneuver that would fundamentally alter the calculus of aerial combat, a simple yet brilliant tactic known as the Thack Weave. It wasn't about outdancing the Zero, it was about outthinking it. Two Wildcats, working as one, turning the Zero's aggressive pursuit into a deadly trap. They stopped trying to mirror the Zero's grace. They started hunting it. They discovered that the very thing that had elevated the Zero to legendary status, its feather-light frame, was also its fatal curse. It couldn't dive fast enough to escape. It couldn't absorb damage. It was quick, yes, but terribly fragile. Elegant, perhaps, but ultimately doomed. A single, well-placed burst from a .50 caliber Browning machine gun could transform that silver ghost, that seemingly invincible apparition, into a falling star, a flaming pyre descending into the unforgiving ocean. Jack Morrison had witnessed this firsthand. In '42, He was a fresh-faced rookie on the carrier deck, a silent observer as a wingman vanished in a flash of smoke and shredded aluminum. He would never forget the suffocating silence in the ready room after that mission. A silence not of grief, but of grim, relentless mathematics. Those hard-won, blood-soaked lessons were meticulously documented, sent back across the ocean to the States, burned into after-action reports, folded into engineering memos. The message from the front lines was brutally clear, utterly unambiguous. We don't need a plane that can match the Zero's elegance. We need a monster that can kill it. A machine that can withstand the punishment and deliver an overwhelming blow. The Zero was mythic, but myths, as we know, are just stories until they encounter the cold, hard reality of steel. So American industry, a juggernaut of production and innovation, went to work. What kind of machine, they pondered, would be built to shatter that myth once and for all? On the sprawling factory floors of Long Island, the engineers at Grumman weren't merely building planes. They were forging weapons. If the Japanese Zero was a surgeon's scalpel, meticulously designed for precision and finesse, then Grumman's creation was a blacksmith's sledgehammer, raw power distilled into a brutal instrument of war. Their factory had earned a nickname, a badge of honor, the Iron Works. When the Navy issued its stark, urgent demand for a Zero killer, Grumman didn't opt for incremental refinement of existing designs. They scrapped them. They started over. The result, the F-6F Hellcat, didn't simply evolve from the Wildcat. It utterly crushed its predecessor, leaving it in the dust of history. It was bigger, heavier, and more powerful in every conceivable way. It wasn't a response. It was a reckoning. It was the physical embodiment of what American industry, when roused from its peacetime slumber and focused with single-minded determination, could achieve when it stopped playing defense and committed fully to overwhelming offense. Jack Morrison had flown Wildcats. He had seen friends, his brothers in arms, vanish mid-turn, shredded by a sudden, devastating fusillade of cannon fire. The memories were etched into his very soul. But when he first stepped into the cockpit of a Hellcat, something shifted within him. It didn't feel like flying in the traditional sense. It felt like being strapped to a colossal, unstoppable fist, a roaring, visceral beast. A 2,000-horsepower engine growled beneath him. The mighty Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, nearly twice the sheer power of a Zero's engine. This leviathan of the skies could climb like a rocket, dive like a meteor, and run down anything in the sky with contemptuous ease. And it didn't just move fast. It hit with the force of an avalanche. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, each loaded with hundreds of rounds, could unleash a wall of lead, a storm of destruction that would simply fill the sky. Unlike the Zero's limited cannons, which relied on pinpoint precision and the delicate dance of aerial combat, the Hellcat didn't rely on finesse. It relied on overwhelming brute force. But the truly revolutionary difference, the aspect that separated it from all that came before, revealed itself not in its offensive power, but in its unparalleled ability to absorb punishment. It was a revelation in survivability. There's a harrowing yet inspiring anecdote from those times. One pilot returned to the USS Lexington with a staggering 47 bullet holes riddling his fuselage. 2 rounds, incredibly, had torn directly through the engine cowling. In a Wildcat, he would have been dead, an anonymous statistic. In the Hellcat, he landed, climbed out of the cockpit, and calmly asked for breakfast, a testament to the aircraft's resilience. This, then, was the new American way of war, a philosophy embodied in steel. Build a plane that could take a punch, give one back with devastating force, and then, crucially, live to fight again. The very tactics of air combat changed fundamentally. No more desperate turning fights, no more chasing phantoms. The Hellcat didn't chase, it hunted. Pilots would climb to altitudes far above enemy formations, then dive in, a thunderbolt from the heavens, fast and brutal. One clean, devastating burst, then pull up, using the Hellcat's superior power to climb away and vanish, a phantom of its own. The Japanese, witnessing this new, terrifying methodology, called it the high-side pass. The Zero pilots, trained and built for slow-speed maneuvering, for the intricate ballet of dogfighting, simply couldn't follow. They couldn't catch. They couldn't survive. The air war had irrevocably changed. The roles were reversed. The hunters, with their agile, deadly Zeros, had now unequivocally become the hunted. And in just a matter of days, this grim new reality would be tested on the largest stage imaginable. When hundreds of Hellcats finally met hundreds of Zeros over the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle in the annals of history was about to commence. What does an empire do when it feels the icy grip of death closing in? In the sweltering summer of 1944, Japan delivered its tragic, desperate answer. The relentless American island-hopping campaign, a strategic leapfrog across the Pacific, was closing in on the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These weren't merely insignificant dots on a map in the vast Pacific. They represented the inner wall of Japan's sacred national defense perimeter. More critically, they were home to vital airfields that, if captured by the advancing Americans, would bring the new, long-range B-29 Superfortress bombers within terrifying striking distance of Tokyo itself, the very heart of the empire. For the Imperial High Command, holding the Marianas wasn't just a strategic imperative. It was a matter of survival, a desperate defense of the homeland. So, to defend these vital islands, Admiral Suemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, launched Operation Eigo, a desperate all-or-nothing naval counterstrike. Every single operational carrier, every usable aircraft, every shred of hope was thrown into the formation of a last-ditch mobile fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. On paper, the force looked imposing, a formidable display of naval power. 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and nearly 450 carrier-based aircraft, backed by hundreds more from land bases. Ozawa's audacious plan was designed to exploit the Zero's renowned long range. He aimed to strike the American fleet from afar, deliver a crippling blow, and force a retreat before the Americans could ever even get close enough to engage his carriers. It was an ambitious, high-stakes plan, born of desperation. But the fatal flaw wasn't in the plan itself. It was in the people expected to carry it out. The veteran pilots, the legendary aces who had once darkened the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and Midway. Those formidable warriors who had terrorized Allied pilots for years. Most of them were gone. They had been killed in action, spent, replaced by a tragic generation of teenagers, boys barely out of high school, with barely 100 hours of flight time in their logbooks. Young men, rushed through gutted, abbreviated training programs, were flying into combat for the very first time, and for many, it would tragically be the last. Can you truly imagine the soul-crushing fear, the sheer, paralyzing terror? Strapped into a cramped cockpit, barely trained, holding the fate of an empire on your trembling shoulders, being told, "You are the last hope." And what were they flying? The legendary Zero was still there, yes, but by 1944 it was a relic, a ghost of its former self, hopelessly outmatched against America's new generation of formidable fighters. The newer Japanese planes, such as the Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, were faster, yes, but terrifyingly fragile, earning them the grim moniker of flying cigarette lighters from American pilots. Japanese pilots, in a stark acknowledgement of their fate, simply called them what they were: coffins with wings. Admiral Ozawa knew. Deep down, he knew. He knew his force was no match, neither in terms of experience nor in the quality of its equipment. But he was betting, desperately, on the legendary Japanese fighting spirit and the element of surprise to carry the day. Ozawa was betting on spirit. America, with its vast, relentless industrial engine, was betting on factories. And in the brutal, unforgiving calculus of modern warfare, only one of them could be right. America didn't send boys to die. They sent targets. By mid-1944, Japan's once feared air power had become a tragic, devastating illusion. The aircraft still bore the same iconic red suns on their wings. Their formations still moved with the rigid, almost ceremonial precision of military doctrine. But the men inside those cockpits, those courageous young souls, they weren't the hardened aces of Pearl Harbor. They were teenagers, their faces pale with anxiety, with barely 100 hours of flight time, strapped into obsolete machines, flying into a sky that was now, unequivocally, owned by the United States Navy. And on June 19, 1944, in the vast, indifferent waters west of the Marianas, that devastating illusion finally, violently shattered. At 10:15 a.m., 20,000 feet above the endless expanse of the Pacific, a chilling yet exhilarating call ripped through the American radio channels. Tally ho, bandits at 2 o'clock high! The voice belonged to Lieutenant Chuck Williams. Nearly 70 Japanese planes, Zeeks, the new code name for Zeros, Vals, Judys, had somehow broken through the outer radar screen and were heading straight, like a determined swarm of angry hornets, for Task Force 58. Lieutenant Jack Morrison saw them first, tiny, almost imperceptible black specks in the shimmering distance, rapidly swelling into a terrifying cloud of wings and spinning propellers. A year earlier, that sight would have been a death sentence, a cold, unyielding guarantee of desperate combat and probable demise. But this was 1944, a different era, and Morrison was not in a Wildcat. He was in a Hellcat. The trap, meticulously conceived and executed, was already set. American commanders, with characteristic foresight and precision, had stacked their defenses high and deep. Dozens of Hellcat squadrons, staggered in altitude, like layers of an impenetrable shield, were all poised, coiled, and ready for the first wave of attackers. The order from squadron leader Hammer Hutchinson was stark, direct, and lethal. Don't turn. Hit and climb. Let them burn. Morrison nudged the stick forward, pushing his Hellcat into a steep, accelerating dive. The wind screamed a banshee wail against the fuselage, a symphony of speed and impending violence. The airspeed gauge climbed relentlessly past 300 and... His target, a Zero, tucked deceptively into formation, its pilot oblivious to the imminent danger, filled his gun sight. He squeezed the trigger. 650 caliber Brownings thundered to life, a deafening roar of mechanical fury. Tracers like fiery arrows arced through the sky, finding their mark with brutal efficiency. The Zero didn't explode in a spectacular fireball. It simply folded. Its fragile wings snapped with an almost sickening crunch. Fuel ignited, and a sheet of flame tore through its frame, a brief, horrifying orange blossom in the vast blue. The sky turned orange for a fleeting second, a vivid painting of destruction. and then the Zero was gone, obliterated. "Splash one," Morrison called, his voice tight with adrenaline, already pulling back into the relentless climb, seeking altitude, seeking his next target. Below him, the tranquil expanse of the Pacific had been transformed into a canvas of chaos. Japanese dive bombers spiraled downward, chased by ominous contrails of smoke. Zeros rolled left and right, their pilots desperately attempting to escape, to evade the unseen, unstoppable predators. But the Hellcats were faster, heavier, and crucially, flown by veterans who had been waiting, yearning, for years for this decisive day. This wasn't a battle in the conventional sense. It was a devastating, unforgiving lesson in aerial supremacy. Hellcat. After Hellcat tore through the Japanese formation with a grim mathematical efficiency that defied belief. Tommy Rodriguez, Morrison's wingman, a boy barely out of high school but already a hardened veteran, lined up a Judy and unleashed a burst that blew its engine clean off. The bomber instantly became a fireball, a flaming comet plummeting towards the water below. In just a matter of minutes, the entire first wave, dozens of aircraft, was utterly annihilated. Not a single American ship was hit. Barely a handful of American planes were lost. From the carrier decks below, awestruck gunners watched as their fighters turned the vast blue sky into a terrifying, one-sided killing field. On the Japanese radio channels, confusion reigned, giving way to dawning terror. Many of the young pilots never even saw the enemy before they died, vaporized in a burst of lead and fire. This wasn't just a tactical victory. It was the death of an idea, a philosophy, the idea that spirit alone could overcome superior machines, the belief that courage, however profound, could cancel out industrial might, the tragic notion that war could still be won with sacrifice alone. What began as a desperate strike had rapidly devolved into something far darker, far more chilling, a one-sided execution. The first wave, devastating as it was only the beginning. Hundreds more were coming, but the young men in those cockpits, bound by duty and doomed by circumstance, didn't know they were flying into history. They didn't know they were flying into a chapter that would forever be known by one haunting, unforgettable name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And it had only just begun. At 11:32 a.m. on June 19, 1944, the chilling question of what happens when war becomes less a fight and more a game was answered in the most brutal, unequivocal way imaginable. Over the Philippine Sea, the vast open skies were transformed into a shooting gallery, and with horrifying precision, only one side had ammunition that truly mattered. The American radio channels, moments before filled with the grim tension of combat, descended into glorious, giddy chaos. "Splash one, Judy. 2 valves going down. Got a Zero on fire." The reports of kills came in so fast, so relentlessly, that no one could possibly keep accurate track. Somewhere in the middle of it all, amidst the crackling static and jubilant shouts, an anonymous pilot, his voice edged with both adrenaline and disbelief, laughed into his microphone. "My God," he exclaimed, "it's like a turkey shoot back home." The phrase, born of the moment's horrifying surrealism, stuck, and by the end of the day, it became less a description and more a grim, terrible prophecy. Because what unfolded wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The second Japanese wave was even larger. A desperate gamble of over 120 aircraft hurled toward Task Force 58 like a last, desperate Hail Mary pass. But the result, with soul-crushing inevitability, was precisely the same. The Zeros, Vals, and Judys broke through in ragged, disorganized formations, their pilots barely able to hold altitude, let alone execute any coherent tactics. Lieutenant Jack Morrison spotted one. A lone Zero, its pilot attempting a turning dogfight against a Hellcat. A maneuver that, just a year ago, might have been terrifyingly effective. Now, it was suicide. The Hellcat simply throttled forward, effortlessly extending out of reach, then climbed, rolled, and dove, a predator making short work of its prey. One clean, devastating burst of 650 caliber rounds tore the Zero to pieces in midair. So violent, so absolute was the explosion that Morrison had to yank his stick to avoid flying straight through the expanding cloud of debris. This wasn't combat. This was anatomy class with live ammunition, a systematic dismantling of an opposing force. Even when Japanese pilots displayed fleeting flashes of their once legendary veteran skill, it no longer mattered. Morrison found himself triple-teamed, a rare moment of coordinated aggression from 3 Zeros, fast, disciplined, a glimmer of their former prowess. But the Hellcat didn't blink. Morrison pulled into a steep, climbing turn. The lead Zero, overconfident, followed for too long. At the apex of his climb, Morrison expertly flipped into a hammerhead stall, reversed his direction with breathtaking speed, and came down behind the pack. His first burst killed the leader instantly. His wingman, Tommy Rodriguez, a lethal extension of Morrison's own will, flanked left and lit up the second Zero, turning it into a flaming wreck. The third pilot, watching his comrades vaporize, panicked. He broke formation and dove desperately for the ocean, hoping that sheer speed could somehow save him. It didn't. Hellcat number 217, an implacable pursuer, caught up before he even hit the clouds, and then a third wave. By 1:15 p.m., another 80 Japanese aircraft appeared on radar, mere blips on a screen. But by then, the Americans weren't merely reacting, they were waiting. Squadrons were being rotated in and out of the fight like perfectly oiled gears in a machine. Fuel, ammo, altitude, timing, everything was tuned to a perfection that bordered on the terrifying. The Hellcats now not only vastly outclassed their prey in quality, but utterly outnumbered them. Morrison, joining a fresh squadron, intercepted 6 Judy dive bombers. He opened fire on the leader, instantly turning it into a fireball before even completing his first pass. The next exploded moments later. The remaining 4 never even made it to their targets, torn apart by tracers and steel before they could even begin their desperate dives. On the radio, amidst the fading euphoria, a grim, almost unsettling realization began to settle in. There were, quite simply, no Japanese planes left to fight. No wave was breaking through. No ships were hit. No carriers lost. The kill ratio was approaching a staggering 10-1, then 12-1. American planes were returning with full ammo belts, their pilots jokingly competing for kills as if scoring points in an air show. The name Turkey Shoot wasn't just a grim joke anymore. It was a eulogy. By the end of the day, over 300 Japanese planes were gone. Not disabled, not damaged, not merely retreating. Utterly, irrevocably gone. And the most chilling part of it all? The vast, indifferent sea beneath them remained calm, almost placid. No wreckage was visible. No survivors retrieved. Just a profound, unsettling silence. How does an entire naval air arm, meticulously built and honed over decades, vanish in a single afternoon? And what happens to a war when one side no longer possesses an air force, when its eyes in the sky are plucked out, its offensive wings irrevocably clipped? The Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot was not a miracle. It was, in its stark, brutal simplicity, pure mathematics. The lopsided kill ratios, the almost unbelievable disparity in losses, were not the result of blind luck or some divine favor bestowed upon one side. They were the inevitable, crushing outcome of staggering, almost unimaginable disparities in training, production, and technology. This battle, so decisive in its immediate execution on June 19, 1944, was not truly won in the skies over the Philippine Sea. It was won months, even years earlier. It was won on the roaring factory floors of Detroit and Long Island, where machines churned out Hellcats by the hundreds. It was won in the rigorous flight schools of Pensacola, Florida, where pilots were forged into highly skilled professionals. It was the ultimate, uncompromising expression of America's industrial approach to warfare, a concept that Japanese leadership, blinded by cultural assumptions and a desperate clinging to traditional martial values, fatally underestimated. Let's dissect this mathematical reality, this almost clinical demonstration of technological and industrial superiority, because within it lie profound lessons. Start with the pilots, the human element, the perceived ultimate arbiters of aerial combat. By 1944, an American naval aviator climbing into the cockpit of a Hellcat had, on average, accumulated over 300 hours of flight time. Many, the truly experienced, had logged more than 500 hours. These were not mere enthusiasts. These were men who had mastered the intricate complexities of their sophisticated, high-powered machines long before they ever faced the terrifying crucible of combat. They trained relentlessly, drilling endlessly, landing on pitching carrier decks in all manner of weather, practicing interception and gunnery tactics until they became second nature, an instinctive dance of death and survival. Their opponents, tragically, were often little more than boys, due to critical fuel shortages that crippled their training infrastructure, and the relentless, attrition-based collapse of Japan's once vaunted training programs. The average Japanese pilot sent into this cataclysmic battle had, in stark contrast, just 70 or 80 hours in the air. Some, almost unbelievably, had never even fired their guns outside of a classroom simulation. They were students, barely out of their flight school textbooks, hurled into a war of seasoned professionals, a fight they were destined to lose before they even climbed into their cockpits. They were told, in an almost desperate plea, to rely on their spirit, their Bushido code. But spirit, no matter how fervent, cannot outclimb a 2,000 horsepower engine. Spirit cannot dodge a 50 caliber wall of lead unleashed from 6 machine guns, filling the air with certain death. Spirit cannot overcome the soul-shattering terror of a sudden ambush at 400 mph from an enemy you never even saw coming, a phantom from above. Then came the numbers, the stark, brutal arithmetic of industrial output. In 1944 alone, American factories, working around the clock, with an almost unbelievable efficiency, produced nearly 100,000 aircraft. Grumman, the iron works on Long Island, was singularly producing over 600 Hellcats every single month. Japan, by contrast, across all models and manufacturers, managed to produce less than 28,000 planes total that year. And even those, often rushed into production, were frequently flawed, plagued by mechanical issues, or grounded due to a crippling lack of vital parts. While the Americans could absorb losses, rotating fresh, highly trained squadrons into battle, every single lost Japanese aircraft, every precious pilot, represented a blow they could not possibly recover from. It was a one-way bleed, a hemorrhage of vital resources that spelled inevitable doom. So, the critical, haunting question arises: why did Japanese leaders, rational military strategists at one point, approve Operation A-Go? How could they possibly look at these devastating numbers, these undeniable disparities, and still believe this was a winnable fight? The answer lies in a tragic, fatal miscalculation. They still believed war was primarily about courage, about sacrifice, about indomitable will. They failed to grasp that war had fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The Americans weren't just flying better planes, manned by better trained pilots. They were flying with vastly superior information, operating within an integrated system that revolutionized the battlefield. Task Force 58 wasn't merely a fleet. It was a complex, interconnected system. Advanced radar systems could detect enemy formations from over 150 miles away, transforming the fog of war into clear vision for the Americans. Fighter director officers on the carriers, working with astounding efficiency, used radio and precise plotting systems to guide their interceptors to the perfect altitude, bearing, and timing. By the time the Japanese were close enough to even spot an American ship, they had already been seen, tracked, categorized, and targeted. They didn't know it, but they were flying, blindly, directly into a meticulously engineered machine that had been patiently waiting for them, calculating their every move. Meanwhile, the Japanese, operating with outdated intelligence and limited technology, were flying nearly blind, dependent almost entirely on eyesight, luck, and tactical guesses. They were pitted against an enemy with eyes in the sky and weapons designed to match that omniscient vision. This was the future of warfare unfolding before their very eyes. This was the pivotal moment when war tipped irrevocably away from the romanticized warrior and toward the cold, hard efficiency of the system. It was no longer courage versus courage, a clash of individual heroes. It was meticulous planning versus desperate hope. It was steel versus paper. And from this moment on, the Pacific War would never, ever be the same again. By late afternoon, Admiral Ozawa was utterly out of cards to play. His final, precious carrier-based squadrons had been thrown into the meat grinder, annihilated with brutal efficiency. What remained was not a fighting force. It was a death rattle, the last, despairing gasp of a dying empire. But the battle, in a tragic twist of fate, wasn't quite over. From the battered makeshift runways of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, Admiral Kakuji Kakuda, a man driven to the edge of desperation, ordered one last, forlorn wave into the sky. These weren't battle-hardened carrier veterans. These were the leftovers, the remnants, training aircraft, museum pieces, spare parts cobbled together with wings, anything that could conceivably take off. They literally bolted bombs onto anything that could achieve lift and christened it a counterattack. It wasn't strategy. It was a funeral procession, a tragic march towards inevitable destruction. Radar picked them up around 5:00 p.m., about 50 aircraft, limping in from the west like wounded birds. When the American pilots saw them, a profound sense of stunned disbelief settled over them. Morrison, already low on fuel, scratched his head in bewilderment as he closed in. The enemy formation included Mitsubishi A-5M Claude biplanes, relics with fixed landing gear, designed before most of the American pilots in the sky were even born. Next to them were G-3M Nell bombers, slow, tragically underarmed twin-engine targets that American aviators had grimly dubbed flying coffins. And that's exactly what they were. They flew in straight lines. They didn't break formation, their pilots perhaps too inexperienced or too resigned to their fate. They didn't even try to fight back, their desperate courage muted by overwhelming odds. Morrison, a sense of grim duty settling over him, lined up on one of the Claudes and squeezed the trigger. His .50 calibers tore the fragile airframe apart as if it were made of paper. The pieces tumbled through the air like confetti, a morbid celebration of despair. Another Hellcat swooped in from above, tearing into the Nells. They exploded in orange blossoms, raining twisted metal into the indifferent sea below. Elsewhere, Lieutenant Sam Houston, a man now weary with the ease of killing, rolled in behind two bombers at once. He barely had to aim. The Japanese gunners fired back with a handful of rifle-caliber rounds, tragically useless against the armored American planes. Both targets burst into flame and fell from the sky, silent screams swallowed by the roar of engines. Houston didn't even break radio silence. There was simply nothing left to say. One entire Japanese torpedo squadron, a dozen planes, was annihilated in under 3 minutes. American pilots began circling aimlessly, almost bored, asking over the radio if anyone still had targets. The sky was emptying, not because the Japanese had escaped, but because they were gone. Utterly, irrevocably gone. Then Morrison saw something, a blur, fast, low, and utterly alone. It was a Nakajima C-6N Mert, a reconnaissance plane. Modern, sleek, and clearly flown by someone who knew what they were doing, a true pilot. The Mert wasn't armed. It wasn't bombing anyone. It was just taking photos, probably trying to document the terrifying size of the American fleet, the damage inflicted, the formation. Perhaps for history, perhaps for pride, a final desperate act of defiance. Morrison didn't hesitate. He pushed his Hellcat into a shallow dive and closed in. The Mert banked left, trying to evade, a desperate maneuver against an implacable foe. But there was no escape. At 300 yards, Morrison fired a short, precise burst. The Mert's tail shredded, and the plane spiraled into the sea. No parachute. That was Morrison's 7th kill of the day, and that, truly, was it. There were no more waves, no more planes, no more illusions. The skies over the Philippine Sea belonged entirely, irrevocably, and unquestionably to the Americans. In a single, devastating day, the Japanese had lost nearly all of their remaining naval aviation. What had taken decades to painstakingly build, to nurture and hone, was wiped out in a single afternoon. And the most chilling, tragic part of all? They had seen it coming, and they had launched anyway. As Jack Morrison stood on the deck of the USS Lexington that evening, his hands, calloused from the stick, were shaking. Not from fear, for fear had been replaced by something far more profound. His trembling came from the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of flying 3 combat sorties in a single day, an emotional and physical crucible. He had personally shot down 7 enemy aircraft, a staggering achievement, more than most aces manage in their entire careers. Around him, the mood on the flight deck was surreal, a disorienting mix of jubilant relief and a chilling undercurrent of disbelief. Laughter, raucous and almost hysterical, echoed between the steel walls of the hangars. Pilots recounted their kills with wide, almost manic grins, slapping each other's backs, the surging adrenaline masking the true, crushing weight of what they had just done, the sheer scale of the slaughter. Morrison's commander confirmed a staggering 47 kills for their squadron alone. Not a single pilot lost. The Hellcat hadn't merely won the day. It had utterly shattered the deep-seated fear that had once haunted every flight over the vast, unforgiving expanse of open water. It had transformed, in a single brutal day, into a symbol of invincibility. But beneath the surface of the boisterous celebration, beyond the immediate euphoria of victory, lay a grim, staggering, and profoundly unsettling truth. The Japanese had launched 373 carrier aircraft that morning, a desperate, valiant force. By nightfall, Only a heartbreaking 29 had limped back to their decimated carriers, silent witnesses to an unimaginable defeat. On top of that, more than 50 land-based bombers, their missions cut short, were simply gone. Nearly 400 aircraft, the lifeblood of an air arm, erased from the sky in a single, devastating day. But the machines were just the beginning of the human cost. Over 3,000 aircrew and pilots were gone. Many of them were veterans, the very individuals Japan desperately needed to train the next generation, to rebuild their shattered strength. Now, they were merely part of the ocean, entombed in twisted wreckage, drifting far from home, their young lives extinguished in a flash of fire and steel. American losses? A mere 29 aircraft. And most of those weren't even shot down by the enemy. They were lost to mechanical failures, to accidents on landing, or to fuel exhaustion in the frantic aftermath of the battle. Fewer than a dozen American pilots were killed. The kill ratio was a staggering, almost unbelievable 14-1. It wasn't just a victory. It was an annihilation, total and absolute. The myth of the superior Japanese pilot, the legend of the invincible Zero, the desperate belief in spirit over steel, all of it collapsed, irrevocably shattered in the brutal skies over the Philippine Sea. For Admiral Ozawa, the grim, unvarnished reality was inescapable. His 9 carriers, once proud symbols of imperial strength and prestige, were now hollow shells. Their flight decks were empty, their hangars silent, echoing with the ghosts of planes and pilots past. Japan's once dominant naval air arm, the very force that had humbled the Americans at Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific with impunity, was gone. Not diminished, not reduced, not merely crippled. Gone. And with it, something else, something far more fundamental, had died. The illusion of parity. For the very first time since the war began, the vast, strategic expanse of the Pacific belonged entirely and overwhelmingly to the United States. The carriers of Task Force 58 could now sail and strike with impunity, unhindered, unchallenged. The Hellcat squadrons, the undisputed kings of the sky, would rule the heavens unchallenged, forever altering the balance of power. But as Morrison leaned on the rail that night, the salt spray mingling with the smell of spent gunpowder, watching the red-orange horizon fade into the oppressive blackness of night, a different, more profound question began to form in the quiet recesses of his mind. What do you tell yourself, he pondered, when your greatest victory, a triumph of such overwhelming scale, feels less like a glorious achievement and more like someone else's funeral? Was this truly how wars were won in this modern age? Not through individual heroism, though that still played a part, but by overwhelming, brutal mathematics, by systems so efficient, so perfectly calibrated, that they rendered the act of killing almost effortless, devoid of the personal struggle of a true fight. The path to Tokyo, the heart of the enemy empire, had just been brutally cleared. But what, he wondered, was the true, lingering cost of making the sky so quiet, so utterly devoid of resistance? As the sun finally set over Task Force 58, casting long, mournful golden rays across the restless Pacific, the last echoes of the day's celebration faded into a profound, almost sacred silence. Pilots, their faces etched with the day's horrors and triumphs, gathered on the deck, their silhouettes dark and spectral against the fiery sky. These were men who had survived, perhaps even thrived, in the most lopsided air battle in recorded history. But survival, that night, did not feel like unadulterated triumph. In the dim, claustrophobic light of his bunk, Jack Morrison lay staring at the unyielding steel ceiling, his body still vibrating with the lingering adrenaline of 3 brutal combat sorties. The cheers of his comrades had faded into the night. The nervous laughter had passed. What remained was something colder, a profound emptiness that no victory, however total, could quite fill. He thought of the kills, yes. The Zero that burst into flame, its pilot's hopes extinguished in a nanosecond. The Judy that spiraled down like a dead leaf, a fiery blossom against the blue. He remembered the exhilarating rush of power, the visceral satisfaction of a clean, perfect shot, the almost surgical precision of destruction. But more than that, more than the visceral thrill, he remembered the faces, fleeting glimpses through shattered glass canopies, frozen in moments of terror, defiance, or resignation. Young, terrified, resolute faces that disappeared in a second under the annihilating fire of his 6 machine guns, swallowed by the inferno. A victory can be total, a complete dismantling of the enemy. But can it ever truly be clean? Can it ever be free of the haunting cost to the human soul? The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not just the turning of the tide in the Pacific War. It was, in a deeper, more profound sense, the end of an era. It marked the death of the lone ace, the romanticized warrior who won battles through sheer individual skill and bravery. The battlefield had fundamentally changed. Courage, yes, still mattered, deeply, but it had been outpaced, outproduced, and tragically outmaneuvered by radar, by evolving doctrine, by an unrelenting industrial rhythm that transformed battle into a chillingly efficient procedure. The Hellcat wasn't just incrementally better. It was a testament to mass-produced brilliance. It was built not to inspire awe in an artistic sense, but to deliver results, to kill efficiently and survive ruthlessly. Its strength lay not in any single pilot's virtuosity, but in the overwhelming, interconnected system behind him. A nation of factories churning out machines, engineers relentlessly innovating, trainers forging skilled professionals, and planners orchestrating a symphony of destruction. America hadn't simply outfought the Japanese in the skies that day. It had outbuilt them, and so began the final, inevitable phase of the war. With Japan's air power utterly shattered, their eyes in the sky plucked out, the vital islands would fall. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, each would be bought with blood, yes, but never again with the paralyzing fear of unchallenged death from above. The sky, once a shared and terrifying battlefield, now belonged, with chilling finality, to one side alone. The Hellcat would go on to post an almost mythical kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1, a statistic that speaks volumes. But that number, impressive as it was, didn't primarily speak to victory in the traditional sense. It spoke to disparity, to an imbalance so total, so absolute, that resistance became less a tactical challenge and more a ritual, a grim procession towards an inevitable conclusion. It spoke of what happens when one side runs out. Not of courage, for courage was abundant on both sides, but of options, of material, of hope itself. Decades later, when Jack Morrison looked back, not as a warrior filled with the fire of youth, but as an old man, his memories mellowed by time and perspective, he didn't speak of glory in the conventional sense. He didn't regale listeners with stories of conquest and individual triumph. What he remembered, above all, was the silence. The eerie, profound silence after a battle that felt, in his heart, more like an execution than a fair fight. And he remembered, most vividly, the question that never truly left him, a haunting echo in the quiet chambers of his mind. If victory is that easy, if it comes with such overwhelming force, then why, he wondered, does it feel so profoundly hard to live with? Because in the end, the Hellcat didn't just dominate the skies. It erased the very need to fight for them, transforming combat into a devastating, systematic demonstration of power, leaving behind a silence that spoke volumes about the true, enduring cost of war.